In our Diwan tonight, we'd like to welcome with us a special guest, Dr. Usaama al-Azami, to talk to us about his upcoming book, Islam and the Arab Revolutions, The Ulama Between Democracy and Autocracy, which is an original examination of the role of religious scholars in either supporting the Arab revolutions or advocating their repression. Usaama al-Azami is a departmental lecturer in Contemporary Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford. He completed his BA in Arabic and Islamic Studies at Oxford, and then his MA and PhD in Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. He specializes in Islamic political thought. So as usual, the session will be a 30 minutes presentation by Dr. Usaama, and then we'll open the floor for questions. You feel free to raise your hand to ask a question or write your questions in the chat box. Dr. Usaama, welcome. We're very excited and happy to have you with us tonight. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. And thank you very much, Rowan and Talal and all the people at Sharq to kindly host me for this presentation. It's, really a pleasure to be able to virtually meet with you, even though it would have been wonderful to meet with you in person. And inshallah, that will be something that we do in the future, in the near future, we hope. And thank you also for giving me the opportunity to speak about my, inshallah, forthcoming book, which is, inshallah, planned around April, May next year, if all goes to plan. And it was originally supposed to come out by around this time, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, things have been delayed, and I think we can all understand that situation. I've sort of somewhat shamelessly plugging it on the first page of this slideshow. So as I go through these, and there are a series of slides, I'm not going to cover everything here, but it's an opportunity, I hope, to give an outline of the sorts of things I'm discussing in this book. But at the same time, this book actually focuses very much on what happened in the early period of the Arab revolutions. So Rowan very kindly introduced the backdrop, which was the Tunisian street vendor, Mohammed Bouazizi, whose self-immolation, in a sense, was the spark to the Arab revolutions. But I basically look with a major focus on Egypt at developments from 2011 to 2013. And so I hope to sort of discuss that period in some detail here in hopefully the next 25 minutes or so. But then within that period, I also want to try and maybe signal some of the things that have happened since 2013, because obviously a huge amount has happened since then. And, for those of you who are interested in that topic, I'd like to also mention that I look forward to writing a book about the Middle East since 2013, tentatively entitled, a little pessimistically perhaps, Making Islam Autocratic. And it will be an exploration of how states in the region, autocratic states, have weaponized Islamic discourse, and some of the ulama, unfortunately, have fallen into this for the purpose of rationalizing and justifying their absolutism, their autocracy. So the what you have on the screen is actually the cover of my book, inshallah, and it's deliberately got a couple of scholars and also Mohammed bin Zayed, who I consider to be in some respects the mastermind behind the current sort of counter-revolutions against the desires of the Arab revolutions. So as I'm just going to sort of dwell for a moment on this, and then head into the actual lecture properly and talk about a few of the scholars. The backdrop, as we mentioned, is what happened in Tunisia. People were getting frustrated and tired of just decades of repression in the Middle East. And unfortunately, that is, of course, continuing right now. But the self-immolation of Bouazizi, which I have an interesting section in one of my chapters, which discusses the legal problems that caused for some of the ulama. And I thought, I have an extensive discussion of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the person on the center of the screen here, the center of my sort of book here. He actually, tries to develop, I think, what is a very sort of sensitive and nuanced response to that particular act. But at the same time, it gives rise to these revolutionary movements throughout the Middle East. And my main focus is after Tunisia's success to Egypt, where very soon after Tunisia's success in mid-January, Egypt, they called for what's now called the 25th of January Revolution. And so they called for protests against the current sort of emergency state. And within 18 days, they managed to unseat Mubarak. Now, those of us who are familiar, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, recognize that it was the army that ultimately removed Mubarak. But and in a sense, they took this uprising against Mubarak as an opportunity to unseat Mubarak and prevent him from putting his son in power, who was not really a man of the army. But it was a revolutionary moment in a sense, and that's one of the things I argue, in that suddenly things which were formerly impossible became possible. And for a period of a year to 2 years, there was this uncertainty, what anthropologists call a kind of liminality that came about, that allowed for the possibility of democracy in the Arab world's most populous country. And unfortunately, as we know, that didn't come to pass. But at the same time, I think it's something that needs to be seen in the long sweep of history. And I think the references at the time to the Arab Spring are quite important, because without trying to be too Eurocentric, it kind of made it kind of signaled a notion of that harked back to the Spring of Nations of 1848 in Europe, which is seen as a kind of seminal moment that took several decades to ultimately realize the democratic aspirations of the people of Europe. So I'm going to actually jump forward at this point, and as I say, if anyone has any questions, whether it pertains to this particular, my particular book, this particular period, or later on, please let me know. I'm going to talk now a bit about certain scholars who are autocracy friendly, certain institutions that became autocracy friendly, and certain states that backed these institutions. And these are well-known states at this point in time. Because this is a bit retrospective, 2011 to 2013, we're talking about scholars who might not be as significant today as they were at the moment, at that time, but they actually still retain, the vast majority of them still retain a significance in the public sphere. So we're talking about Ahmed al-Tayyib, the Sheikh al-Azhar, Ali Gum'a, whose activities are notorious from 2013 in particular, Ali al-Jifri, who's a student of Ali Gum'a but based in the UAE. And the UAE is really, as I've suggested, kind of the nerve center of this kind of authoritarian Islam. Abdullah bin Bayya, who, for those of you who've been following in sort of recent days, pronounced the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist organization, including, this is not altogether new from him, but we may have the opportunity to talk about why on earth a sort of respected jurist of his standing would, see it fit to use such an emotive term, such a dangerous securitized term, against an organization that is ultimately sort of calling for democracy in the region, rather than, it's nothing comparable to something like ISIS or Al-Qaeda. In fact, ISIS and Al-Qaeda explicitly do takfir, or deem the Muslim Brotherhood to be, kafir. And so, these scholars, and I'm just going to very quickly go over, this is Ahmed al-Tayyib, as you can see with the Sheikh al-Azhar over there, Ali Gum'a, Ali al-Jifri, you can see the two of them are very close, and Ali al-Jifri kind of sees himself as a student of Ali Gum'a. Abdullah bin Bayya, and you can see sort of the company he keeps. So he is currently the most important scholar in the United Arab Emirates. And what's really interesting is he's actually based in Saudi Arabia. So, it's something to watch what will happen in the medium to long term as MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, tries to assert himself more strongly. Saudi Arabia is traditionally the sort of like heavyweight in the region. And the UAE has found in Mohammed bin Salman a kind of protege. Mohammed bin Zayed has found a protege that they can use, but that use is going to be, undoubtedly not something that lasts for the long term, because MBS will surely try to reassert his dominance in the region once again. But here we have MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the de facto ruler of the United Arab Emirates, kissing Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya on the forehead. He has appointed Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya as, forgive me, I've got a sore throat, so I'm going to drink water throughout this presentation. He has appointed Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya as effectively the Grand Mufti of the United Arab Emirates. He's sort of the chairman of the Emirates Fatwa Council. And alongside him, for those of you who are watching from the West, you have, his deputy is Sheikh Hamza Yusuf from California. So this is a global network who is sort of the current Mufti of Egypt, the successor to Ali Gum'a. And so all of these scholars, and finally I mentioned Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who's a sort of noted North American scholar, who has also become one of these voices for supporting really Arab autocracy as, far superior to democracy in his view. I'm going to go over the institutions very quickly. Al-Azhar, the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, and I would also add here the sort of Emirates Fatwa Council. And this was formerly, what you can see on the sort of bottom of this particular slide, is the International Union of Muslim Scholars. This is where bin Bayya was formerly one of four vice presidents to a scholar who he now effectively has on multiple occasions called a terrorist, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and who, before he joined the United Arab Emirates in 2014, sorry, he considered in some respects a mentor, even a teacher. He's some years his senior, but also a colleague, and he sort of treated with the utmost respect. Going back decades, for those who are interested, you can sort of Google Yusuf al-Qaradawi Abdullah bin Bayya, and you'll find I've made a short translation of his very respectful sort of, in a sense, a eulogy or a panegyric, a sort of short essay in praise of Yusuf al-Qaradawi that was published on the occasion of Yusuf al-Qaradawi's 70th birthday. Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi is based in Qatar, and Qatar has been one of the sort of major states that's been backing sort of the kind of revolutionary change that I would argue is democratic in its orientation in the region. And Al Jazeera has for decades now been sort of recognized as promoting, an open kind of discourse with, undoubtedly with certain kinds of limits given. But it's certainly by the standards of competitors in the region, such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia, Qatar's sort of public discourse through Al Jazeera is remarkably free. And so it is not altogether surprising that a place like this would host and also be, to a certain extent, shaped by the discourse of someone like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's actively been promoting democracy since the 90s and perhaps earlier. And so even though Qatar itself is not a democratic state by any means, I think they've recently tried to introduce sort of democratic elections in local councils and things like that. And I suspect there are challenges in the sort of regional dynamics that are, they're currently under blockade from their neighbors, the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Under those circumstances, these kinds of efforts to democratize are probably things that are of secondary consideration, though they shouldn't remain that way for very long. So Yusuf al-Qaradawi is actually 96 years old right now. Abdullah bin Bayya is born in 1935, so he'd be around 85 years old right now if I got my maths right. And so these are two very important figures. Finally, I'll mention Taba in passing, but I won't spend very much time on that. I've mentioned the geopolitical dimension. Now, there is some history here, and I'm a bit conscious of time, but I just wanted to maybe mention a brief history of the Egyptian revolution, very brief history. So in 2011, and specifically what the ulama were engaged in the Egyptian revolution. So specifically, you have the three scholars, Ahmed al-Tayyib, Ali Gum'a, and Ali al-Jifri, all of whom were very opposed to the Arab sort of initial revolutionary upsurge in sort of January of 2011 in Egypt. And by contrast, people like Yusuf al-Qaradawi were actively supporting it. Hamza Yusuf and bin Bayya were actually lukewarm. They didn't actually make very clear statements. In fact, Hamza Yusuf was interesting because he actually actively vocalized his support in a blog post that is still on his website, under the title something like "When the social contract is broken on one side, it's broken on both sides." And so he's, actually revolutionary in his discourse in, something he must have written in early February, shortly before the ouster of Hosni Mubarak, the longtime dictator of Egypt. And then by September or October, he gave an interview, I think quite predictably on the UAE's sort of Al Arabiya network, saying that, well, I don't really think, democracy is good for the Muslim world. We need decisive leaders who aren't held back, and are not corrupted. I mean, he made this rather astounding statement at the time, which he's never explained and doesn't make any sense at all, unfortunately. But he said that, well, monarchs and autocrats, he didn't use the word autocrats, but kings are uncorruptible because they have everything anyway, right? And it's one wonders on what sort of like, in what political universe that is even close to a reality of any kind that we can recognize. Those of us who observe politics in the Middle East and have watched the way in which people like MBS have undertaken shakedowns of the rich and wealthy in his society, and completely in a sense destroyed any possible competition to his hegemony over power while his ailing father is ostensibly king, will recognize that it's certainly possible to be all powerful, so to speak, in a political sense, and still be quite corrupt. So I think that the key moment that a lot of us recall, and I'm going to actually quickly jump back to my first sort of like slide, and you see what's going on here on the bottom is people are protesting with the famous Raba'a sign. And Raba'a is something which happens in 2013. You have basically the Egyptian coup that sort of summer, which is supported by Ahmed al-Tayyib, Ali Guma and others, and the Raba'a massacre, which Ali Guma very aggressively sort of supported. So this chap on on the left, he basically, former Grand Mufti of Egypt, came on television and told the Egyptian army, shoot to kill. You are entirely justified in what you're doing. These people are sort of filth and trash, and they don't deserve anything but death, in a sense. And so that was in a sense the sort of most shocking moment of 2013 for many people, and perhaps one of the most shocking moments of the decade. Of course, those of us who are attentive to wider dynamics will recognize sorry, that within a few days of the Raba'a massacre, you had the gassing of the use of chemical weapons and that was a very, very sort of like dark day, the deaths of huge numbers of women and children in that process. And it was also a day on which America was proven to really not have any sort of real teeth behind its threats of saying that there were certain red lines, and one of them was chemical weapons in Syria. And of course, there are all sorts of complicated dynamics of how to respond to, a figure like Assad, because it's not, taking out Assad, as Donald Trump apparently once suggested, will do very little to actually solve the problems of a country like Syria. So, there are very serious challenges involved in these sorts of circumstances. Now, in 2014, this is where things get a bit interesting. Abdullah bin Bayya, who had remained silent in response to the Raba'a massacre, and I say he'd remained silent about the Raba'a massacre, he actually wasn't entirely silent. In the days that led up to the Raba'a massacre, he was actually in the United Arab Emirates in 2013, heaping praise in public events on the ruling class of the United Arab Emirates. And I've documented this in an article that I wrote, that talks about Abdullah bin Bayya and what I describe as the sort of neo-traditionalism's ideological struggle against Islamism. And I categorize Abdullah bin Bayya as a neo-traditionalist. Sometimes this is called traditional Islam. Some people will designate this as Sufism, which I personally think is a little reductive, because Sufism is something which transcends neo-traditionalism. But in any case, this was neo-traditionalism's struggle against Islamism. And by Islamism, I mean, tendencies that are affiliated or related to the Muslim Brotherhood in some way, shape, or form. And that kind of, more politically oriented approaches to Islam. In some respects, I consider Islamism to be those who are particularly interested in, the political concerns of the Ummah, so to speak. Whereas you could say neo-traditionalism was originally particularly concerned about the spiritual concerns of the Ummah, but it has unfortunately also become concerned in problematic ways with the political concerns of the Ummah. So Abdullah bin Bayya sets up the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, this unwieldy sort of acronym FPPMS, and also something called the Muslim Council of Elders. And in the last 2 years also has set up the Emirates Fatwa Council, where he is the head as well. And I want to actually sort of run to a conclusion very quickly, because I've actually got a lot of slides, but I don't plan to go through them. I wanted to just actually signal some sort of democracy scholars, people like Muhammad al-Hassan Wald al-Dado, al-Shinqiti, he's from Mauritania, and very sort of like forceful critic of the way in which states are using Islam to justify autocracy. Salman al-Auda, Hafidhahullah, who's currently in Saudi prison for the last 3.5 years now, 3 and some years. But he wrote an important book called As'ilat al-Thawra, where he sort of explores some of these questions about Islam and democracy. Now, I mean, these people aren't writing things out of the blue. He wrote that, if I recall correctly, in 2011/2012. There's a long tradition of Islam and democracy discourse, several decades old, that these people can easily mine. Much of it coming from Egypt. People like Tawfiq al-Shawi has probably written the most comprehensive work on this. Shura, Democracy. I can't remember the second part, but Fiqh al-Shura wal-Istishara is something like a 800 or 900 page book on sort of how to instantiate a Quranic concept of consultation in the public realm. And these are, I think, necessary in dealing with the overwhelming power of the state in the modern period. And so, these are some of these scholars, and I'm happy to sort of discuss some of the hadiths and the Quranic verses that they use to justify this. Other than that, let me just conclude now. As I say, there's a lot of questions, a lot of slides, but let me conclude with some of this. I mean, so this is kind of the authoritarian. I particularly like this image on the right. This is a parody of a statement which is often attributed to Imam Malik. كل يؤخذ من قوله ويترك إلا صاحب هذا القبر is the original phrase. That everyone can, you can take from their knowledge and you can leave some of it, meaning you in some aspects and leave them in some aspects. إلا صاحب هذا القبر, except the person in this grave. And Imam Malik is said to have been pointing at the Prophet ﷺ's grave. So this, in our own time, has been translated by pro-authoritarian scholars to كل يؤخذ من كلامه ويرد إلا صاحب هذا القصر. And qasr, as those of you who are not familiar with Arabic, means everyone you can take from and leave except the person who is the master of this palace. And we currently live in that situation, and it's worth thinking about how we can change that. I hope that's been interesting. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Thank you very much, Usaama. I think we still have some time if you'd like to go through the legal aspects and arguments of the two different camps.
Sure.
So please feel free.
Okay, so let me sort of, if you just give me a moment, I'll bring the slides back up. But I should say that if anyone does want to ask any questions, please feel free. So with respect to, let me look at some of the um, authoritarian sort of justifications, so to speak. I'm going to have to find these to a certain extent. To be honest, I haven't articulated these as explicitly as I have, the positions of the scholars who are in support of democracy. So, in many respects, the scholars who are in support of democracy, they articulate their opposition to the authoritarian position by citing the same sources that these scholars who are trying to promote autocracy will cite. So these are usually hadiths which are sahih. They are sort of, according to the Sunni tradition, entirely authentic and attributable to the Prophet. In some cases, that's brought into question by some of these scholars. But then there are also verses in the Quran which are suggestive. And I've got first here the response to an authentic hadith which is in Bukhari and Muslim. And the response, I've kind of underlined certain parts of this in order to sort of signal the response of Muhammad al-Hasan al-Dado. And this hadith of Ubadah ibn Samit, I'll try and sort of like read the Arabic from memory actually. بايعنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. We pledged allegiance to the Messenger of God, peace and blessings be upon him. على السمع والطاعة, to hear and obey, meaning to render one's obedience. في العسر واليسر, in difficulty and ease. وعلى في العسر واليسر والمكره والمنشط, whether it's that's actually the same sort of idea as difficulties and ease. وعلى أثرة علينا, even if others are sort of given preference over us. وألا ننازع الأمر أهله, and this is, I think, the crucial point. So we hear and obey, we render obedience, and then وألا ننازع الأمر أهله, that we do not contest the authority of those in power. Now, if we stop there in the hadith, then it does very much authoritarian outlook, that you render absolute obedience. But the hadith doesn't end there, of course. It continues and it says إلا أن تروا كفرا بواحا, which seems to suggest a very high bar, unless you see clear disbelief. So this is actually quite important, because from this the scholars sort of recognize that unless there is very explicit disbelief, you cannot rebel. And if anyone looks at the dictionary on what rebellion means, it means to engage in armed insurrection against the state, right, against those in power. So you shouldn't engage in armed insurrection unless you see clear disbelief, although scholars also point out, or if you are being sort of aggressed against in a way that you have to basically defend your own life. But that sort of self-defense doesn't necessitate rebellion per se. The principle of not rebelling against sort of political power is basically it's a very understandable principle, in the sense that if you look at what's going on in the US right now, they are having what looks to be hopefully a peaceful, even if slightly unsteady, transition of power. And even though there are probably sections of the right that would really countenance the idea of getting onto the streets with weapons, that's not something which is really something that they will ultimately, inshallah, do, because they recognize that the state actually needs to have continuity so that governance has continuity. That's not what we're talking about when we think about sort of the next part of this hadith. So you don't engage in rebellion, armed insurrection against the state, unless you see clear disbelief. And this, incidentally, I mean, there's a great article by, I should remember his name, an Israeli scholar who has written an article on, he works on fiqh of minorities and has written a book on Yusuf al-Qaradawi, incidentally, or deals with fiqh of minorities, looking at Yusuf al-Qaradawi. But he has an article about the Muslim Brotherhood and their doctrine of rebellion. And they basically adhere to the Sunni mainstream, that rebellion is impermissible, this is the Sunni mainstream, unless the harm done through rebellion is less than the sort of a result of gaining power. So unless there is certainty that one gains power in an absolute sense, one should not engage in trying to take out the state altogether. But the rest of this hadith actually says, وأن نقوم أو نقول بالحق لا نخاف في الله لومة لائم. That doesn't prevent the fact that, you know, rebellion, armed rebellion, is not under normal circumstances sort of justified, does not mean that you cannot speak out for the truth. And what we need to think about in places like Syria, for example, which are, you know, going through very tragic and difficult times, is that you know, the people didn't actually start off with rebellion. They started off with standing up and speaking the truth, which is what the hadith actually explicitly encourages, that you don't fear anyone but God, and you sort of speak the truth, speak truth to power. Now, when that speaking of truth to power results in the absolute sort of violence of the state, then self-defense can be justified and with a certain degree of proportionality. And then it can convert from a situation where you are in a case of rebellion to a situation where you're in a case of civil war. So the legal dimension of that shifts at that point. And, you know, civil war has other sort of legal rulings, and it's complicated, and none of this is, of course, desirable. But having an authoritarian in power who is willing to literally kill people in the tens of thousands, in the hundreds of thousands in a place like Syria, is highly problematic and needs to be actively opposed by whoever is able to, with whatever they're able to. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for tawfiq in that. I wanted to finally just mention two things. One is the hadith. There is a hadith which says, hear and obey your ruler even if he lashes your back and takes your wealth. This is in Sahih Muslim. Some scholars say it's weak, and other scholars like Muhammad al-Hasan al-Dado point out that this is actually, the longer versions of the hadith explain that this is, if the caliph is treating you in that way, it doesn't justify responding to the caliph. Now, none of the, last I checked, none of the rulers of the Muslim world currently call themselves the caliph. You can make maybe an exception with the King of Morocco, who calls himself Amir al-Mu'mineen. But, you know, that's, you know, a rather, it's a rather weak argument in this particular instance to say that, therefore, this hadith applies, at least according to these scholars. Of course, Salman al-Awda, for his part, actually argues that this is a weak hadith, and he's doing this based on Daraqutni, and it's actually one of the few hadiths in Sahih Muslim which has been critiqued as being, you know, weak. And you know, it's not an isolated opinion by any chance, by any stretch of the imagination. The other sort of, I should really have started with the verse, but I was starting with Sheikh Muhammad al-Hasan al-Dado first. But the most important verse, arguably, that pertains to sort of obedience to rulers is this one, which again is being critiqued by people like Salman al-Awda, on not the verse naturally, but the understanding of the verse that these people are promoting. So the verse, which if I recall correctly is in Surah Ma'idah, I should know this, it may be in Surah An-Nisa, is Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul. O you who believe, obey God and obey his messenger. And then what's interesting here is the verse, the verb obey does not repeat itself. It says, and those who are in authority among you, which is why the scholars point out, well, obey God and obey the messenger, that's absolute obedience, there's unconditional. And those in authority among you, that's basically tabi', or it sort of attaches to their obedience to God and the messenger. And so I've actually, again, if people are interested, I've written an article about this in sort of trying to contextualize the, in my estimation, sort of mistaken understanding of this verse by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And you can Google sort of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf rebellion, and it should come up as an article. But in that, I cite numerous scholars from 1400 years of Islamic history who, you know, point out that actually this kind of rebellion, sorry, not rebellion, but this kind of rendering of obedience is not necessarily sort of unconditional in the way that modern sort of pro-autocracy scholars are trying to argue. In fact, in my estimation, that kind of argument that is being produced today by these scholars as persuasive as it might seem to a lot of Muslims who are sort of looking at it and reading about it, they should recognize actually that it's extremely exceptional in Islamic history to have this level of absolute obedience. I mean, if one reads Abdullah bin Bayya's writings, where he effectively says, if the ruler makes a, if the ruler makes a certain ruling on something that they assess to be in the public interest, the scholars have no right to object. And this is basically, in my estimation, unprecedented in Islamic history, in Islamic legal history. I don't know of any scholars who've made this kind of blanket permission for the rulers to override and overwrite what scholars have to say. It really is, in some respects, quite sort of like, it boggles the mind. But if you look at this particular verse, which is actually the key verse, يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم. Sorry, I should. It's been a long day and I'm a bit unwell. But the rest of the verses, if I recall correctly, يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم فإن تنازعتم في شيء فردوه إلى الله والرسول إن كنتم تؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر. If you dispute about anything, so for one thing, that the verse actually countenances dispute between the rulers and those that they have authority over. So if you dispute anything with those in authority, because obviously you're not disputing anything vis-a-vis God or his messenger, that's not really countenanced in this verse, and it's not countenanced in the tradition. But if you dispute something, فَإِن تَنَازَعْتُمْ فِي شَيْءٍ, with those in authority, فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَالرَّسُولِ إِن كُنتُمْ تُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ. Then go back to God and his messenger. For us, that would mean go back to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, if you truly believe in God and the last day. And so the notion that this verse in some sense gives absolute authority to rulers to do whatever they like is really indefensible. I wanted to conclude that. I've noticed that I've gone on for a while, but I hope that this was somewhat beneficial, inshallah. And I'm sort of looking at the chat, and some people are asking questions, so if you like, I can sort of respond to some of these questions. But Rowan, if you like, you can sort of ask the questions and act as moderator.
Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Usaama. Actually, yes, we'll take the questions. If anybody would like to speak directly, please raise your hands. Otherwise, we'll take the questions from the chat box. And first of all, I'd like to ask you a question about the point you mentioned about the permissibility of rebellion only in the case when the results are better in the situation than the situation when there's authoritarianism.
Yeah.
And the case of Syria, unfortunately, is being used as an exemplary of this kind of disastrous fitna that comes out of the paradigm of uprisings. This is how Islah and Nasiha, which is usually the traditional kind of ruling, legal ruling, is considered more correct. So I don't know if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. I'd be more than happy to address that. So there are two types of responses to a situation like the Syrian situation. One is to basically, and two kinds of intentions behind this kind of response, saying, look at what's happened in Syria, right? One intention is coming from a good place. People are well intended behind it. And one intention, I would argue, is coming from a place of opportunism. The people who are arguing sort of from a good place are thinking, well, and I would argue they are looking at this somewhat superficially. They're not thinking with the benefit of historical hindsight. They're saying, look, you shouldn't have gone and rebelled in Syria. Look at what's resulted. Now it's everything's in absolute chaos. But the reality is, who rebelled, right? I mean, like, no one was rebelling against the state until the state brought out heavy artillery and started bombing people, right? And at that point, people have the right, in fact, the Shari sort of obligation to defend themselves, right? Once the, some of the scholars have described this as, it's not the case that the people are rebelling against the authorities. The authorities are rebelling against the entire people, right? So this is a case of self-defense. It's very different to, and once the state really forces you into a position of, you have to basically take up arms in order to be able to survive and, maintain your, stay alive, basically. That's not really a case of a normal rebellion. Those sorts of rules about rebelling against the ruler don't really apply in a case where there's tadafu' bayn al-Muslimin. The Sunni tradition is very careful about, takfir. Syria is a complicated case because the sort of the theological differences that exist, and it's a very sensitive issue there. But just because in a country like Egypt, Sisi has literally killed thousands of Egyptians who are opposed to him. It doesn't make him a kafir according to Sunni thought, but it doesn't justify absolute obedience to them. I mean, there's so much possibility and so much variety in the way that one can respond to these situations. And for scholars to come and say, oh, look how terrible Syria is, the Sunni tradition says we should always be obedient and never rebel. That's not a case of rebellion, right? That's a case where the state has responded to people giving nasiha and giving advice. One of my teachers, actually, Sheikh Muhammad al-Yaqubi, was thrown out of the country because he stood on the minbar and he gave nasiha, right? In that sort of situation, when the sort of state responds with heavy artillery, we're no longer really thinking about a situation where, we can say this is a situation where the scholars or the people of Syria have rebelled against the state. No, actually, the state has instigated a rebellion because of their use of heavy artillery, and that instigation of rebellion is actually self-defense. That would be my response to. There are some people who use this kind of argument. The other people, this is the well-intended argument, the other people are opportunists. They're basically prostituting the legal tradition for their own sort of very despicable ends by saying, you should never rebel, look what's happened in Syria. And hopefully most of the people making that kind of argument are not this kind of person. But if someone is like that, that's a really terrible person to be. I hope that sort of responds. Sorry if it's a bit sort of a harsh judgment, but these are very serious issues in my view.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so now I'll go for the questions we have in the chat box. We have Hatib Noor asking, how do you define democracy and differentiate between Shura and democracy, I assume, and how do you define them as one?
Yeah, so I don't define them as one. I mean, the second part of the question is, do you define them as united? So there's actually, there's a discourse on Shura and democracy that goes back a few decades, as I've mentioned. I sort of disagree with people like Sheikh Rashid Ghannouchi, who argues, or kind of seems to use in his 2012 book, Democracy and Autocracy في Islam, he seems to use the term democratia interchangeably with Shura. I think Yusuf al-Qaradawi kind of characterizes democracy as a technology. We adopt technologies from other civilizations, and that's how we're having this sort of wonderful international event right now. And in the same way that we have physical technologies of this kind, we can have political technologies that we adopt. I think for me, the ultimate sort of like, they say in usul al-fiqh, la mushahata fil istilah, that technical terms, you don't need to quibble over technical terms. What really matters for me is that there is accountability of there's a kind of muhasaba and there's a kind of shura, in the sense of, there is a give and take and a reciprocity between those who are in power, who have been entrusted in power. And, some of the scholars, they conceptualize this as those who are ajir, meaning they're actually hirelings, the people who are at the service of those of us who've put them in those positions of authority. And this is actually something which you can read even in the classical works, that in a sense the Khalifa is a servant of the Muslim community, ultimately a servant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but their task is to serve the Muslim community. So in a sense, I'm using the language of democracy to point out the sort of the gross iniquity involved in the forms of authoritarianism that is trying to be pushed upon large numbers of Muslims in the name of Islam very often. And there are plenty of scholars who've written about Yusuf al-Qaradawi has a fatwa. If anyone's interested, you can Google Yusuf al-Qaradawi democracy, and I've actually provided a translation which is not my own of that fatwa on my academia page. You can have a read of it, and I think it's a it's a fairly persuasive fatwa that this kind of government and having accountable government that is voted in, etc., is perfectly legitimate from an Islamic perspective. At the same time, one of the things that I write about in my own sort of scholarship, so far unpublished, is that Islamic democracy is different from liberal democracy. In a sense, democracy is a technology, and it can be instantiated in different sort of conceptual universes. You can have or different ideological settings. So if you're a liberal, you have certain sort of paradigmatic ideas that are fundamental, and which democracy is there to uphold. And in the same way, you can have Islamic democracy. And I think sometimes it's called illiberal democracy, and I don't like that term, because liberal and illiberal are kind of like in the modern sort of social imaginary terms, which are good and evil almost. Whereas I think Islamic democracy is something that is conceptually defensible and needs to be developed in greater detail, and has been in the Arabic language by people like Farid Abdul Khaliq, by people like Tawfiq al-Shawi, and various other scholars. And in a sense, I like the people like Muhammad Imara, rahmatullahi alayh, a great scholar of Egypt from the last who passed away earlier this year, and perhaps the most prolific scholar in Egypt in his lifetime. He says, no, democracy and Shura are two distinct things, and they should be recognized as such. But defining democracy would take several lectures and probably a few books. So I'm not going to attempt to do that here. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. I'll move to the second question, a little bit maybe related. So is there a default position for scholars to act as a counterweight, or is the default position for scholars to act as a counterweight to political authority, or to be at the helm of it?
So scholars have rarely been at the helm. Islam, and some modern scholars argue or state this in the following terms: Islam is not theocratic. Bismillah. Now that term has certain meanings in European history, and a lot of in the modern sort of liberal imaginary, having any form of religious sort of presence in the public sphere or in politics is considered theocracy. But by this, what the ulama mean is that the ulama aren't supposed to be those in power, and they don't speak in God's name and wield political power at the same time. A number of scholars have written about this, whether it's Sherman Jackson in Islamic Law and the State. Recently, I really enjoyed the book of Andrew March. He's got, in his chapter 2, he talks about the concept of sovereignty in Islam. And basically, he describes it, and also Patricia Kroner in her sort of medieval Islamic political thought, published in the US under the title God's Rule. The Sunni tradition basically recognized a kind of division of labor. The scholars controlled Islamic law, and the political classes implemented much of that law, and they also had kind of political authority and decision making that was a consequence of their political position. But all of those decisions had to ultimately be in the maslahah of the ummah. So by framing those decisions within maslahah, they were also subsuming their decision making within the sharia, which was ultimately in the control of the ulama. So the ulama never themselves, or very rarely did they themselves actually rule. There are sort of like these curious cases in places like Andalusia, where a ruler was deposed by the qadis of that city because he was, I can't remember the actual details, but and so they took over for a period until another sort of ruler came. And the ruler in Islamic sort of political theory is supposed to be a mujtahid, ideally himself as well, and it's usually a himself. I mean, there's a good, I think, literature in the modern period from people like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Muhammad al-Ghazali, and others who argue that modern heads of state, because they're not caliphs, do not actually have to be male. And people like Ashraf Ali Thanvi argue this as well. An excellent article by my sort of colleague at Oxford, Salman Yunus, makes this point. And so, that's a slightly different gendered question. But the scholars, in a sense, were there to act as a check, ideally, on the ruler if the ruler's going out, getting out of line. But other than that, they basically administered the public sphere. Anyone who was educated in a Muslim in a Muslim land in Islamic history was kind of almost by default a scholar, because that was the nature of education at the time, which creates complicated questions about what is an alim today, because you have plenty of educated people, and they're not necessarily specialized in ulum shar'iyya, but they have the same cognitive abilities of someone who was specialized in ulum shar'iyya historically. They just don't have the same material. But that's a slightly different question, so we don't need to go into that.
Thank you. We have a question from Muhammad Tahiri asking, how do you define neo-traditionalists? So you mentioned about the concept of neo-traditionalism. And what's the reason for the likes of Hamza Yusuf and Abdullah bin Bayya and others like Jum'a to support a crackdown? So basically, kind of what's their reasoning, or what's their reasoning behind their position?
So those two separate questions. Let me take the first, neo-traditionalism, and as I say, there are other scholars who describe this in different ways. So very often people from within that trend will recall it traditional Islam, and sometimes they'll capitalize traditional Islam. And the way they will very often define it is that it's the complex of you have a commitment to the four madhabs of law, usually Ash'ari and Maturidi theology, although some of them will also extend that to a certain extent to ideas like the Hanbali tradition, but it's seen with a certain degree of suspicion in some respects. And then you also have the Turuq Sufiya. I'm making preliminary explorations on a certain question, but Ahmed Shamsi has recently written an excellent book called Rediscovering the Islamic Classics, where he kind of fleshes out this concept of the post-classical. It's already been used, but he, I think, does an excellent job in detailing it further. And in a sense, I think neo-traditionalism can be sort of almost used synonymously with post-classicalism or post-classical Islam, which is kind of the form of that Islam took from 1500 onwards, in which you had the four madhabs, you had the Turuq Sufiya, and you had Ash'arism and Maturidism as the dominant theological schools. And there's a sort of a certain type of claim to isnad, which I personally, in my forthcoming book, in an epilogue, which I'm still deciding whether or not it'll go into the final version, but it probably will, inshallah. I basically problematize the distinctions between neo-traditionalists, Salafis, and Islamists that I use as typologies in my own writing, because someone like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he was the top of his class at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels, at postgraduate level among 500 students across 3 different colleges of the Azhar. And he's someone who was deeply influenced by Imam al-Ghazali. The first book that he read was Minhaj al-Abidin, or I think it was Minhaj al-Abidin. And then he, when he was imprisoned with the Muslim Brotherhood as an Islamist, so to speak, one of the major books that he took with him and that he really read to his content, and something which he had in his hands from the age of 14, was Ihya Ulumuddin of Imam al-Ghazali, which is, these are archetypal Sufi texts. And Shaykh Qaradawi is, I would argue he's a Sufi, even if he's not a formalized member of a tariqah. He's a faqih, even if he's not a formalized member of a madhab. And so, and he, doesn't have any problem with people following madhabs. He writes about this in, various works of his. So, where does he fit? But at the same time, he will bypass the madhahib and go to the Quran and Sunnah very often. So maybe he's a Salafi as well. So I think a lot of these labels are very limiting. And so I'm not sure it's always useful. Just to answer the second part of the question, and maybe I can just say read my book when it comes out, inshallah. To a certain extent, I think there is different players have different reasons, but one of the justifications that I've kind of tried to argue in a short paper, which is called Neo-Traditional Sufism and Arab Politics, you can see it on my academia page, you can download it there if you like, is I try to argue that these people actually think that their conception of Islam, what might be called neo-traditionalism, is the true Islam, and it's really under threat by the power of, if Islamists come to power, they will threaten true Islam, which is the Islam of the Azhar, sometimes they will say. And therefore, desperate circumstances call for desperate measures, and that would justify the massacring of, people on the streets for the greater good. So that's one reading of it, and Allahu A'lam, really. We just hope that we're not the people being asked on Yawm al-Qiyamah, the question of why did you support that crackdown against hundreds of unarmed people.
So we have Imad who raised his hand, would like to speak. Shall we give him the floor? Imad, would you like to speak?
I think his mic is muted, so I'm not sure.
Assalamu alaikum, Doctor. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for spending so many years of your life to deep dive into these issues that are on all of our minds, actually. And I think the reason they're on all of our minds is because all of us want to affect change. That's the reason we study these things, Shura. What kind of nations and countries would we actually like to live in? Would we like to see these 2 billion Muslims live under, as opposed to the current state where we have the people's basically opinion or views of how their country should be run and how their resources should be spent is totally not there. In the way the dictatorships run right now, they could care less about what the people think. And it always strikes me that there's not one Muslim country where opinion polls are legal and halal, free and unfettered opinion polls where you can ask any question you want. And that gives you a big indication of how we live these days. So if we're talking about effecting change, and your book and what you're saying is that basically the bottom line is that for every Salman Aude or Sheikh Qaradawi, there will be 2 Azhar or Emirati type sheikhs to counter. And if so,
I don't think that's the case, to be honest. I think those people are greatly outnumbered because of the moral and ethical force of the tradition, but they are amplified by those in power. So they don't get the pulpits basically, and they don't get the TV stations, and yeah.
But at the same time, they're throwing their money, and either with tarhib or targhib, you'll find that ridiculous, surreal situations where even the imams of the Kaaba have to toe the line of the rulers, etc. And you'll always have this internal give and take between Muslims every time you tell them an ayah like وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ. You'll have another guy saying pro-dictatorship, just arguing back and forth forever. Right. So if so, and if the Muslims these days are so divided, split in half, between those who say, Ammi, it's too much trouble to stand up to these people, they have too much Emirati backing or Israeli backing or American backing, and it's impossible to affect change. And the other half that says, no, it's wajib to affect change. And do you see any way out? I mean, as far as revolutions go, no revolution has ever consumed or had the consensus of 100% of a population. Even the American Revolution, maybe 30% of the British subjects in America wanted to revolt against. The rest were happy to be British subjects. The only thing I can think of in kind of modern times is the first Intifada, where every single Palestinian home was involved in the resistance. Right. But generally speaking, you never get these 50, 60, 90% consensus of people to step forth. So how does change happen, Doctor? Sorry for taking so long.
No problem at all. Thank you for the question. And I mean, there's actually interesting social science literature. And, I always have this, I wear 2 hats. I'm sort of a historian, an academic, but I'm also, someone who's deeply committed to the sort of the rights of people that are being trampled on in parts of the world I study. And so there's this great book by Neil Ketchley. I should remember the title, but Egypt in a Time of Revolution, and it's very quantitative quantitatively sort of informed. And he basically notes that social scientists have pointed out you need roughly 5% of the population to come out onto the streets for a revolution to succeed. So it's these things are very sort of happenstance very often. It's not always something which we can, even if a revolution like happened on the 11th of February in 2011 in Egypt, even if they succeed, the revolutionaries represent a very small cross-section of society as a whole. So, there is the bigger sort of task of, how do we thereafter go forward as a society. And I think a lot of the challenges that you highlight and you point out, people are like, oh, I can't do very much, this is too much for me, these people have taken over, I'll just give up, so to speak. I think this is part of the human condition, right? I mean, some people will be able to face up to the challenge, and some people will struggle to, and they will sort of try and seek comfort where they can. And everyone individually will have to think. There's a verse in the Quran, بل الإنسان على نفسه بصيرة ولو ألقى معاذيره. Everyone will have to think about their own circumstances, and if they have a genuine excuse, they're excused. But human beings can assess for themselves whether, okay, have I really made an effort to try to do what I can to maybe instill change? And this is something, in a sense, it's a spiritual question for a Muslim. This is something I ask myself on a regular basis, that, am I doing enough? And I always feel that no, not really, and I need to do more. But that's the state of the believer, right? They will keep on trying, and those who give up, I think that it's a sad place to be. But what's really, I'm sorry, I'm also trained as an alim, and so I think of these things in spiritual terms very often, and that's why my sort of discussion is veering in that direction. But I look at these sorts of problems, and I always remember that life is finite, and the akhirah is infinite, and people will, justice will be done. I know that. So I'm working because I, according to my belief, God requires me to work towards justice in this world. Even if I don't succeed, I am ma'jur, inshallah. And if that's not motivation enough for people, I think they're a bit too attached to the dunya, to be honest. But Allahu a'lam. I hope that sort of is some way to going to a useful answer.
I'll just take like 2 last questions. Do we have that time?
I'm more than happy to. My wife is holding the fort down with the 2 children upstairs, but I don't want to put her through much more of this.
Okay, so I'll just quickly take the one last question, and then we'll conclude. So Aisha is asking, what's the role of Muslims who are a third party when 2 groups of Muslims are in armed conflict? The situation will keep coming up, unfortunately, and there's no clear guidance from scholars in that regard.
I agree that it's unfortunate when this happens, but I would say that this is something which is envisaged in the Quran, and it takes place in the early community. And so in a sense we do recognize it's unfortunate, but we also recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has tested us in this dunya with this sort of thing, and to see تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا. That God creates life and death to test people ultimately. And so you have the guidance which is in from a Muslim perspective, which is in Surah Al-Hujurat, وإن طائفتان من المؤمنين اقتتلوا فأصلحوا بينهما. So that's the original position, that when 2 groups of believers are fighting, and that's the situation, that's the verse that applies in a case like Syria, right? It's not the verse of أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم. This is a case where 2 groups of, well, I mean, as I say, in Syria it's a bit complicated because of the Alawi situation, but if you have a situation where it says وإن طائفتان من المؤمنين اقتتلوا فأصلحوا بينهما, when 2 groups of believers are fighting one another, try and reconcile. فإن بغت إحداهما على الأخرى فقاتلوا التي تبغي حتى تفيء إلى أمر الله. But if one of them goes to excess, one of them goes to violence and bloodshed to a degree that is not justified by the grievance, فقاتلوا التي تبغي حتى تفيء إلى أمر الله, then you have to actually take sides in the battle, and side with those who against those who have gone to excess, and fight them until they come back to God's rule, so to speak, or the ruling of God. And and then, you know, the verse also, it's beautiful because it says, إنما المؤمنون إخوة فأصلحوا بين أخويكم. You know, even in this sort of situation where people are fighting each other to the, you know, in some cases to the death, because that's what فإن بغت إحداهما على الأخرى seems to suggest, there is bloodshed. Still, don't forget brotherhood, right? إنما المؤمنون إخوة فأصلحوا بين أخويكم واتقوا الله لعلكم ترحمون. And you know, have taqwa, be conscious of your duties to God. You know, that's supposed to be the ultimate sort of restraining order on yourself to prevent you from going into that situation. So, you know, what's really extraordinary about our tradition, and this goes back all the way to the Quran, obviously, is that it's so rich and so well informed about dealing with precisely these sorts of challenges. And it gives us this rich sort of spiritual reservoir to contend with the challenges that we face. So, you know, I hope that that's a hopeful note on which to end.